Saturday night at the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. Tourists and art lovers taking advantage of the free admission hours. When suddenly, a blizzard of white leaflets and banners denouncing the Sacklers. The protest all led by a group called PAIN, Prescription Addiction Intervention Now, a group founded by famed photographer Nan Goldin, who joined the so-called die-in on the floor of the Guggenheim, all part of an effort to demand this museum and others like it around the world give back the millions of dollars the Sacklers have donated to them.
We demand that museums take down their name. Take down their name. Disassociate from them. Disassociate from them. Refuse money from them. Refuse money from them.
It's good. It's really sexy and beautiful and really well coordinated.
The Guggenheim didn't know it was coming?
No, nobody busted us. Nobody spoke. We don't even use emails. We're really good at this now.
Very guerrilla action, really?
That's the word. OxyContin almost killed me.
Goldin told me that her efforts against the Sacklers are all very personal, that she herself was addicted to OxyContin for some 3 years. The drug first prescribed for her, she says, after a wrist injury suffered in Germany.
And I ended up locked in my apartment.
It almost killed you?
Oh, my God. Yes, I was on massive doses, and my whole life was OxyContin.
For years, the Sackler family has been one of the great patrons of the arts around the world, even before their company began making OxyContin. There's a Sackler wing at the Louvre in Paris. At the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, there's the Sackler Courtyard and the Sackler Center. A Sackler Gallery in Washington, a Sackler Museum at Harvard. In New York, the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Temple of Dendur is housed in the Sackler wing. And down the street at the Guggenheim, there's the Sackler Center for Arts Education.
Is it fair to ask the museums to give back the money? Sorry?
Yeah. Whether they'll do that is one thing, but they can take down the name. Meanwhile, they can disavow themselves. They can make a point that they're going to refuse future funding, not just do it silently, but speak out.
The protest came as the investigation of the Sacklers and their company, Purdue Pharma, appears to be picking up speed.
We found that Purdue misled doctors, patients, and the public about the real risks of their dangerous opioids, including OxyContin.
The Attorney General of Massachusetts, Maura Healey, released her own blizzard of documents, the result of a lawsuit she brought last year against both the company and 8 members of the Sackler family who served on the Purdue Pharma board.
Their strategy was simple. The more drugs they sold, the more money they made, and the more people died. We found that Purdue engaged in a multi-billion-dollar enterprise to mislead us about their drugs. Purdue pushed prescribers to give higher doses to keep patients on drugs for longer periods of time, without regard to the very real increased risk of addiction, overdose, and death.
In a court filing, the Attorney General revealed the speech that Richard Sackler, then Senior Vice President for Sales, gave at the launch of OxyContin. The launch of OxyContin tablets will be followed by a blizzard of prescriptions that will bury the competition, he said. The prescription blizzard will be so deep, dense, and white. Nat Goldin's group says it wanted to create its own blizzard of white leaflets in the protest at the Guggenheim.
When you see all the documents released by the Attorney General, what does that tell you?
It tells me that they attempted murder. It tells me that it's not just money. I mean, it's money to a point of sickness, so dark.
The Attorney General also made public an internal email written by Richard Sackler when he was president of Purdue Pharma, urging company officials to shift the blame to the people addicted to OxyContin. We have to hammer on the abusers in every way possible. They are the culprits and the problem. They are reckless criminals.
Shame on Sackler! Shame on Sackler! Shame on Sackler! Shame on Sackler! Shame on Sackler!
Nan Goldin says her group is emboldened by the documents being revealed by the Massachusetts Attorney General. It's been almost a year now since they began their protests, and so far, no museum has heeded their call to return the Sackler money. The biggest target being the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where the group returned once again this week.
We're here to call out the Sackler family who've become synonymous with the opioid crisis. We're here to call out all the museums who allow the Sackler name to line their halls, tarnish their wings, who honor the family who made billions off the bodies of hundreds of thousands. We came here a year ago. We're knocking on their door. They've done nothing.
My son, Jeffrey, was prescribed OxyContin for a knee surgery in high school. He wanted to wrestle that season, and the doctors told him, you can do it if you take the pills every 4 hours. Take them before the pain starts. Take them on schedule. They caused me, believing what the doctor said, to be an accomplice to my son's death. When my son talked of his pain, I said, did you take your pill? I became an accomplice to my son's demise. That's not right.
The Metropolitan Museum of Art says the Sacklers have been generous patrons for almost 50 years, but that the museum is currently engaged in a review of its gifting policies.
We'll be back!
A spokesperson for the Sackler family declined to comment on Nan Goldin's protest or the allegations she made against the family. The company itself, Purdue Pharma, says the Attorney General's complaint is riddled with what they call demonstrably inaccurate allegations. As for the Guggenheim Museum, our request for someone to appear on our program tonight was also declined. We are now joined by Barry Meyer, who, as a reporter for the New York Times, has done much of the groundbreaking work on OxyContin and the role of Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family. He's the author of the book Painkillers, An Empire of Deceit, and the Origins of America's Opioid Epidemic. Also joining us by Skype is Rob Reich, a professor of political science at Stanford University and director of the university's McCoy Center for Ethics in Society. Mr. Reich is also the author of Just Giving, Why Philanthropy is Failing Democracy and How It Can Do Better. Professor Reich, let me start with you and ask you, what do you make of Nan Goldin's protest against the major museums that carry the Sackler name?
It's a fantastic activist effort to get more people to pay attention to the long-standing and hardly novel activity of people who make a lot of money and then seek to enhance or sometimes cleanse their reputations by giving generously as philanthropists. And I think it's appropriate for Nan Goldin and all activists to force the Guggenheim Museum and any other place that's taken money from the Sacklers to make a public statement about why the museum or the nonprofit entity wishes to be an accomplice or to be complicit in the reputation laundering of the Sackler family.
You'd call them an accomplice for taking the money and putting up the name.
Certainly they're complicit in the kind of public-spirited generosity that the Sacklers wish to be known for, else they might not have wanted their name to be put on the side of all of the buildings and on the various halls that are the recipient of their philanthropic gifts.
Now, of course, the Sacklers themselves have not been charged with the crime. The company did plead guilty to a felony count of misbranding, but the individuals of the Sackler family were not charged. Is it fair to label them in this way?
No, well, I'd say it's too early to say, but if they are convicted of crimes, then I think the situation for the museums changes dramatically, because we've gone from the act of complicity in reputation cleansing or laundering to a new situation in which effectively then the money received from the Sacklers is akin, in my mind, to something like stolen goods. And I mean, here's an easy way to think about this, that if I take your watch, Brian, and I go down to the pawn shop and sell it, and then I have a bunch of money from your watch, and I give it away to a super effective nonprofit organization like the Guggenheim Museum, and I tell you, look at all the good that I've done with the money that I got from your watch. Your just complaint to me is, I don't care about the good that you're doing. Give me my watch back and repair the harm that you caused. And one thing that the Guggenheim Museum might consider doing if the Sacklers are convicted of actual crimes is not merely taking the Sacklers' name off the building, not merely giving the money back to the Sackler family, but giving the money to the victims of the people who have died from the OxyContin scandal.
Barry Meyer, let me ask you, what's the status of the investigation? Does the Attorney General up in Massachusetts have the goods?
You know, it's probably a little too early to tell, Brian. These are lawsuits. We're just starting to see these documents emerge. But what's startling in this long story, I mean, a story that's been going on for almost 20 years, is we really are getting one of our first glimpses inside Purdue. Purdue for many years has kind of created the narrative that the Sackler family was sort of these beneficent owners of Purdue. They sort of were hands off. But now we're seeing that they were hands deep in the micromanagement of the company.
These internal emails with Richard Sackler especially really do tell the story that you've been telling for years.
It's stunning. I mean, you know, I first ran across the Sacklers 20 years ago and learned about Richard Sackler and heard about his activities. But the callousness, if that's in fact what he was expressing, or the view that only, you know, bad people would get addicted to this drug is sort of ridiculous, because sadly there are patients, people that were customers of Purdue Pharma, who became dependent and or addicted to these drugs.
And with the Purdue Pharma company now saying the Attorney General's complaint is false, they're trying to vilify unfairly the company and its executives, and they point out that of all the opioids sold, only 2% are OxyContin, and that most of the deaths now come from heroin and fentanyl.
Well, let me just say, as a general rule, when it comes to Purdue Pharma, they've had a history of blowing smoke. Up until the time that they were criminally convicted of lying to doctors, lying to patients, they claimed they were innocent as snow. They claimed that they were abiding by the law. So I would take anything they say with a grain of salt. And they have always from the very beginning tried to minimize their role in this crisis. The fact of the matter is, as Richard Sackler so amply pointed out, they wanted to take over the market for narcotic painkillers in the United States. That was their goal. That was because they wanted to profit from this market. They wanted to blow away the competition. They did it, and there was huge havoc as a result.
And the death toll now, some say as many as 400,000?
Well, I mean, that's the overall death toll. It's hard to know how many of those you can assign to OxyContin. And I think it goes beyond the actual death toll. I mean, we become very fixated on death and overdoses. But there are, you know, thousands of patients in this country, probably tens of thousands of people whose lives have not been changed for the better from using OxyContin. They've been changed for the worse, because they've become physically, emotionally, and psychologically dependent on this drug. They've lost, you know, their ability to live daily, and they would be far better off if they were given other types of pain treatments.
Professor Reese, let me ask you, given all of that, and the museum certainly have to know that, why have they not heeded the calls to take the names down?
Well, there's a tension that any leadership of a nonprofit organization has. All nonprofits need to raise money to carry out the missions. All the nonprofit leaders are invested, of course, in thinking that the mission that they're pursuing is a good one. And if they can raise money from people that haven't been convicted of crimes and that they can extend some social recognition to, well, that's common practice in any large nonprofit organization. Now, with all of these questions raised about the Sackler family, I think the leadership of the various museums and cultural institutions need to say something about why, in light of these allegations, they're willing to nevertheless accept the money. And I mean, to be fair to people who work in nonprofits, Stanford University, where I'm sitting, is one such example. One occasional attitude is that the problem with tainted money is that there just tain't enough of it. And what excuses the pursuit of the nonprofit's acceptance of the money is the goodness of the mission of the nonprofit, and that you can somehow separate out the means of making the money and then the good that's done once the philanthropic gift has been made. And as I said before, I think when an actual crime has taken place, that separation is no longer tenable. If I do really good things with stolen goods, that has nothing at all to do with the badness of my initial theft. In the case where a theft hasn't yet been shown or a crime hasn't yet been shown, as with the Sacklers, these are just accusations or allegations as I understand them, then I think the appropriate thing to say to the leadership of the museums is that in light of the allegations, what will happen if they are convicted? What will the museums do? And secondly, given that their names still adorn the buildings, are there any lines that a museum would draw in accepting money from people who are tarnished in the public eye?
Professor Risch, thank you very much. Barry Meyer, thank you very much for being with us. Again, we asked both the Sackler family and its company, Purdue Pharma, to have someone on our program tonight, but they both declined to do so.